Finally, the game we all have been waiting for. Magnus Carlsen is playing with the white pieces against the reigning world champion Liren in the Grenke Chess Classic. It's a really exciting game. We all want to know who is the real world champion. Let me know in the comments your thoughts about that, but I would like to show you what happened in this game. It's in fact not a classical time control, but it's what we call sort of modern classical time control with only 45 minutes per person plus 10 seconds increment, and it's really exciting. A lot of interesting things are happening in this game, which I would like to show you. And in the meantime, I just ask you very kindly to subscribe to the channel and let me know what you think of this game. So here we go. Magnus is playing with the white pieces. Goes for the move 1d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5. And we know this can go into many different directions. You can play g3, which leads to the Catalan opening. But here Magnus decides to take on d5. We have the Queen's Gambit declined, very well-known structure, the Carlsen structure after black takes back with a pawn on d5. White is having an extra pawn in the center, black is having an extra pawn on the c-file, leading to an imbalance in the structure. So all the ingredients are there for a sharp positional battle. Knight c3, c6, and Magnus plays here the move bishop f4. Sort of a modern treatment of this line. Magnus has been experimenting with it quite a number of times in the past. Most people place their bishop on g5 to exert more pressure on black's position by pinning the knight on f6. But with bishop f4 we get a position which is also very interesting. Bishop f5, white goes for the move e3. And after knight bd7, first interesting moment as Magnus Carlsen deviates from a game he played before against Jan Nepomniachtchi in St. Louis 2022. In that game he played a move h3 so that the bishop can always go back, or preparing even a move like g4. But here he goes for a much sharper idea with the move knight h4. He is attacking immediately the bishop on f5. And there are different ways of reacting. You can go back to e6, to g6, to g4. Ding decides to play here the move bishop e4. And after the move f3, attacking the bishop on e4, the bishop goes back to g6. So now anytime the knight can take on g6. But before doing so, Magnus grabs some space on the king side with the move g4. Excellent idea. And the big question is, how is black going to complete its development? What is he going to do with its king? Is he going to castle kingside? Maybe that doesn't look very attractive. Now white is already announcing its plans of expanding on that side of the board with a pawn on g4. And maybe later the h-pawn will come as well. So I think a very good plan, a logical way of playing here would be to play knight b6 with the idea of getting the bishop to d6. Offering the exchange of pieces will make it easier for black to play. But Ding goes instead for the move bishop e7, eyeing that knight on h4. So knight takes g6, h takes g6. And here Magnus goes for the move queen c2. There are different ways of playing, but his plan is pretty straightforward. Now after knight f8, white castles queenside. Of course, castling kingside is not an attractive idea when you're expanding with your pawns on that side of the board. So the king is totally safe here. And still, I think black should look for opportunities to initiate some exchanges of minor pieces. So still, I like bishop d6, but Ding instead goes for knight e6, attacking the bishop on f4. The bishop drops back. It's a good piece, open position. You don't want to allow that particular exchange. Bishop d6 was played now, but here white has the additional option of keeping that bishop on the board. There's no need to take on d6, which is totally okay for black. But look, Magnus comes up with a very interesting idea. Bishop e1. Now you may think why he's going back with his pieces. Well, he believes that in this kind of structures with an imbalance in the pawn formation, asymmetrical pawn formation, the bishops are potentially much better than the knights, which are standing there, but they're unable to exert any pressure on white. So it's just a temporal misplacement of the bishop e1. The bishop will get back into play at some point. Let's see. Queen c7 played. And here white goes for the move king b1, which is interesting because the pawn on h2 is now threatened 3 times by black's pieces. But there's no time to take that pawn. For instance, if you take with the bishop, then white will add a 3rd piece hitting the bishop on h2. The bishop can't go away as it will hang the rook on h8. And if you decide to take instead first with the rook, well, then the problem, and this is pretty sure what Magnus had been calculating, after the exchange of rooks on h2, bishop takes h2. Now you first start here with the move g5 to kick that knight away. An excellent idea. So the point is that if you take that pawn, now the move f4 can be played with tempo, hitting the knight on g5, but at the same time that pawn is closing the diagonal, so that now white is also threatening here to take that bishop on h2. So long story short, you can definitely not take the pawn on h2. And of course, Ding will not fall for that kind of trick. Decides here to castle queenside, which is a solid move. But now white goes here for the move h4. Very nice idea. And I would like to show you some positional ideas, because for instance, a move like bishop g3, it's what black would like to play here, to initiate the exchange of pieces once again. But I'm pretty sure Magnus had been counting on this move, knight b5, attacking the queen. That's a great shot, because after c takes b5, capturing the knight, now you can take with the bishop on g3, and the queen is not allowed to take the bishop because of the pin along the c-file. Now we understand better Ding's next move, as instead of bishop g3, he prepares now the move king b8, a solid move, tucking the king away into the corner. Absolutely good idea. And bishop g3 is on the agenda. Therefore, rook g1 played. Magnus doesn't want to allow the exchange of bishops. He believes that his bishop is better. The bishop even protects the pawn on h4. White is still in control. a6 is played. And now rook g2. Mysterious rook move, but the rook is not only guarding the g3 square, it's looking for a way to get employed on the second rank. So the bishops, they don't have to be developed. They can just stay there, at least for the moment. g5 played. Black is looking for an opportunity to challenge the kingside. If you do take on g5, the knight will recapture and hit the pawn on f3. So Magnus plays h5. And still, it looks quite a very promising position for white. Now the kingside has been closed. There are quite a lot of ideas, for instance, to expand by advancing your pawns on the queen side. You can move the queen, the rook can come over, and at the right moment you will look for a way to break through, to open up that side of the board. Ding doesn't want to sit and wait. Decides here to change character of play by playing the move c5. After pawn takes c5, bishop takes c5, black accepts that he has an isolated queen's pawn. It's still well defended, and he's also looking to win the pawn on e3. So how to react here as white? That is the big question. You would expect Magnus to defend the pawn on e3, but he seizes the initiative with a beautiful pawn sacrifice. Knight a4, opening up the c-file, hitting the bishop on c5. Bishop takes e3, and now queen to b3, attacking the bishop. And okay, there are various moves, but you can see that white is planning various ideas, including to capture the pawn on a6, exploiting the pawn on b7 being pinned. But after the move d4, rather than taking that pawn on a6, because of queen c6, things are far from simple. Everything is hanging now. Magnus, not interested in the material. He activates his rook. Rook to c2. Very nice idea. Attacking the queen. The queen goes to d6. And now another tempo move. Bishop a5. Attacking the rook on d8. And here, you have to be very careful as black. For instance, if you just move the rook away, offer the exchange of rooks, that just fails to. Rook takes rook. If you take back, now all of a sudden the queen on d6 is no longer defended, and with the move queen takes e3, you're exploiting another pin, the d pawn. If it captures the queen on e3, white will capture on d6. So that is one tactical idea. If you instead play rook d7 to keep that queen defended, now queen takes e3 is not a possibility, but then knight b6 is a very annoying move. All these tempo moves, they don't give black the chance to consolidate its position. Now if the rook goes away, you can play knight c4 and everything is hanging. The rook on c7, the queen on d6, white is winning. So black in big trouble here, under pressure, decides now to give back some material by playing the move queen d5. He's saying, Ding, that okay, you can take the rook on d8, I will swap queens. And after that, I will take back with the rook on d8. I'm an exchange down as black. But things are not that simple because black has a passed pawn. Now that pawn is not going to become dangerous, but it is very difficult for white here to activate the rooks. There are almost no open files. How should white proceed? Maybe something like bishop c4 with the idea to add more pressure, maybe to take on e6 and get a knight into c5. Magnus plays it differently, goes for knight c5 straight away, but here, look at this. The knight comes into d5. The knight is having a nice grip on the position. You may take on e6, but after taking back, how is white ever going to activate one of its rooks? You have a tremendous compensation here, like a beautiful knight. All the pawn breaks have been avoided here. Maybe rook f8 will come, pressure against the pawn on f3. I think black is absolutely okay. So Magnus didn't want to take on e6. Instead, he played bishop d3. And after knight to b4, which is a knight fork, hitting the rook on c2, knight takes e6 played first, attacking the rook on d8, so black of course takes back. And now white goes here for the move rook to c5. So the rook is looking for an opportunity to come in, maybe at the right moment come to e5, hit the pawn on e6. And therefore, I think black is still okay if he tries to consolidate its position with a move like bishop f4, e5 can come next, and as you can see, this bishop is guarding the c1 square, so difficult for white to activate a rook from d1. But here followed the move rook d5. And that's a remarkable decision. Let's try to understand what black wants to do. He wants to trade off one pair of rooks, so that very soon the king can try to come in to the center. But why did Magnus not take on d5? I think that would have been an excellent move. For instance, if you take on d5, there is something like bishop to e4, adding pressure to the knight. The king can probably come very, very quickly. So this looks great. It will be easier for white later on to create a breakthrough. Maybe even rook h1 and h6 can be played. Well, if you take with the pawn, now this brilliant idea I want to show you. It's not a forcing sequence, but after bishop to f5, let's say the knight goes back to c6. Here, with a move like f4, and this is so difficult to see, guys, but this is the key moment where Magnus could just have tried to get an almost winning advantage. The idea is that you cannot take with the pawn. Then g5 will be played. It's a 2 versus 1. And if you try to run yourself as black, h6 is played, g takes, and g6, white's g-pawn, is distracting black's minor pieces from setting up a fortress. While in case you do take with a bishop, then it's bishop e6. More and more pawns are getting exchanged, and that helps white to create open files. Maybe you win the pawn on d5, you can activate a rook, the king can come to the center. Things are looking great for white. But instead, Magnus, he didn't play this move. He went for rook c4, keeps the rooks on the board, attacking the knight on b4. Probably he was counting on knight c6 and then bishop e4. The bishop can trade itself for the knight. This looks great, but Ding has a much better move. He plays the move a5. Beautiful blockade. The knight is stable, cannot be kicked out by a white pawn. And after bishop e4, attacking the rook goes back to d6. Rook c5, attacking the pawn on a5. b6 can be played. Note, of course, that the bishop on e3, it's defending both d4 and the pawn on g5. So nothing better than just going back with the rook to c4. e5 is played here. And Magnus, how is he ever going to improve its position? No open files. The king is not able to come closer, get into the center. So he decides to give back the exchange. And after a takes b4, he played here the move king c2. Now, you see that black is a pawn up, but strategically, it's still a bit risky. Now, Magnus's idea is that if black goes for king c7, you probably will put a king on d3. That's a great move with a plan of getting in with your rook via the a file. And then if you can win the pawn on g7, for instance, okay, it's white who is dominating the situation on the board. So Ding comes up with a very good defense. He is not interested in material. He just gives back the extra pawn with the move d3. He kind of forces the exchange of rooks. And now we have an opposite colored bishop endgame. Bishop goes to c1 to hit the pawn on b2. But after king c4, black, it's basically the last moment in the game. He has to be very careful still. Don't take that pawn on b2. It's totally not relevant to take that b pawn because it doesn't create a passed pawn yourself. White would play here king d5, walk in with the king to the pawn on g7, wrap up that pawn, and the h-pawn decides. So rather than taking on b2, black first got to play here the move king c7, king d5, king d7, not minding the pawn on e5. The king comes over to the king side. You're defending very well. The bishop still defends the pawn on g5, and white is simply unable to create a passed pawn on the king side, because after bishop d2, you just keep waiting, keeping the pawn defended. King g6, the king defends the pawn on g7. h6 would never make any difference. You can just take, and the bishop is neutralizing the 2 versus 1 on the king side. So bishop d5, bishop c1, bishop to c4. Black, of course, is never going to take on b2, because after king takes g5, it will be 3 versus 1, and white is technically winning. So you just play waiting move once again, bishop d2, bishop d5, and the players agreed to a draw. I thought this was a really interesting game, and I think Magnus came up with a very interesting idea in the opening, just to get a playable position. And I think he was very nicely outplaying the current world champion in a very impressive way, but unfortunately for him, he was not able to capitalize on his advantage. Let me know what you think of this game. I thought it was very cool, but I'm curious to hear from you as well. So, one last favor, once again, please hit the subscribe button. See you soon again. Bye bye.